Okay, as she said, my name is Francis Epplin, and I'm with the Department of Agricultural Economics and affiliated with the Bio-Based Products and Energy Center, and of course with the Oklahoma Agricultural Experiment Station at Oklahoma State University. And I don't know why the slides are not up, but the good news for you is that Karen budgeted me for 7 minutes rather than 12, so strap it on. Okay, briefly with the Bio-Based Products and Energy Center, we evaluate holistic systems from beginning with acquisition of land use services all the way through to bio-based products. And so my job is to talk about options for effective policy, and I want to differentiate between crop residues, where the transaction would be between farmers and a biorefinery, and perennial crops, where the transactions would be between landowners and the biorefinery. And I think that's an important distinction. So for crop residues, the policy issues are if there's only one biorefinery in a supply shed, then the biorefinery can exercise market power. In addition, there's the issue of risk. There's risk to the biorefinery of insufficient feedstock, and there's the risk to the farmer. There's both a production and a quality risk. From a farm perspective, depending upon the farm operation and whether they have livestock on the farm or not, this is a high-risk, low-reward potential business. The risk comes in from the weather, which there's a very narrow harvest window for corn stover in the Corn Belt in places like Iowa and Illinois and Indiana. And there is harvest time competition between the high-valued grain crop and the lower-valued stover crop. So the BCAP program that we've discussed is not particularly effective at addressing either of these issues, the market power or the risk issue. Now, I want to move on and talk about the perennial crops, where the transaction would be between the landowners and the biorefinery. As we know, the prudent investor would not invest in a biorefinery that did not have a reasonably certain supply of feedstock for the expected life of the biorefinery, and landowners would not establish a perennial crop until a long-term contract is signed. Now, we have historical precedents for these long-term contracts. The Conservation Reserve Program, the CRP, was established in 1985. By July of 1987, more than 22 million acres were leased, and most of them were seeded and established in perennial grasses. So I conclude that acquisition of land services and establishing perennials should not be a major impediment to the development of lignocellulosic biorefineries. Developers confident of their conversion technology and the expected profitability of their process, they can engage in long-term land leases. And the long-term land leases would facilitate a highly coordinated, vertically integrated field-to-product system. They would enable the establishment of either a single species or a portfolio of species. They would enable the system to engage in feedstock quality control. They could have a highly coordinated extended harvest system, and for, depending on the location in the country, for much of the year, a just-in-time delivery system. From a landowner's perspective, the long-term lease mitigates the market power issue because the biorefinery would have to pay the going rental rate in order to lease the land. But there is a risk that the landowner would incur that's not currently involved in the CRP program, is that the perennial may be established on the land and the biorefinery will default. So one policy issue to address that landowner risk issue would be the USDA Risk Management Agency might facilitate lease insurance to protect landowners from any type of breach of contract with a biorefinery. Now, for the biorefinery, the long-term lease would enable the biorefinery to reduce the risk of insufficient feedstock because they could select a portfolio of land to lease, and they could also select a portfolio of species. And as far as potential government involvement or policy to address these issues, you could enable cooperation between the USDA, FSA, and NRCS and biorefinery developers. The USDA has substantial experience regarding establishment and maintenance and management of long-term land leases. And you could enable biorefineries, for example, to purchase services from FSA and NRCS. Now, another option for effective policy is to continue the investments in education, to develop the engineers, the scientists, the economists, the social scientists, the businessmen, the next generation of entrepreneurs to develop more and more efficient systems, and also to continue the investment in research so that we can discover and design and develop more efficient systems. So there are certainly challenges, and perhaps the most important one is we need to develop economically viable conversion systems. We need a profitable business model, but we need to recognize that energy is a commodity, and it is extremely difficult to compete with fossil fuels. So with that, in my 7 minutes, we're ready for questions. Seeing none? Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Frank. It's an interesting concept of using the RMA to come up with some sort of insurance or mitigation program. But given the fact that the oil market tends to be so volatile, how would you realistically set a price for a long-term lease? I mean, you know, what we've seen in the past 20 years in oil prices is they're all over the place.
So the question is, how would we set how would we evaluate the actuarially sound insurance cost, I think is the question, right? I have no idea, but I'm sure RMA could figure that out, right? What I'm talking about here is, let's say a biorefinery wants to use a woody crop or a miscanthus or switchgrass. So they go out to the landowner and engage in a 15 or 20-year lease. And so every year the landowner receives a payment for that land. Now, the risk is that the biorefinery will default and the crop is established on the land. Now, the landowner has to go in and do something else with that crop, either get rid of it or plant another crop. And so all I'm talking about is an insurance policy that says if the biorefinery goes bankrupt or defaults on the lease payments, that there be some compensation, and that would be the type of insurance that I would envision.
Do any of the panelists have any comments?
So I would, I have some knowledge of the CRP and how that works, and those rent, and someone should correct me if that's changed recently, but the rental rates are set by state committees, and they take into account county. Basically, what they're looking at are cash rental rates for agriculturally productive land, and to the extent that, in some cases, those cash rental rates are in excess of what actual rental rates are in a county, in which case you have more land going into CRP and land coming out of agricultural production. Other cases are lower, and so to the extent that producers would need some sort of option value, so I want an additional price for my CRP payment, essentially to engage in a 10 or 15 or 20-year contract. So I think the USDA has the ability, they know what cash rental rates are, so they would be able to devise a program, a CRP, or a modified CRP with rental rates that reflect cash land rental rates. but also some premium or option value that and maybe that's an insurance value as well. I think one challenge with using the CRP, and it certainly is overcomable, is the management practices that are currently allowed. So CRP currently has pretty restrictive management practices on land, and to the extent that those perennial grasses need to be managed, if it interferes with nesting habitats or any sort of wildlife habitats, that currently would not be allowed in the CRP. And so that's one of the primary challenges that needs to be addressed with that program as I see it.
But understand that I don't see this as being a CRP program. What I say is a privately held company can engage in long-term land leases with private landowners. And they could use the expertise of FSA and NRCS to help them identify land that would be suitable for the type of production that they wanted to harvest. One more question? Anybody have a question here? I don't see any questions back there. Okay, thank you.